But again, it's sort of that thing of like the enacted play, like that part just has to exist, because otherwise it does take years for people to make an integrated shift. But they can play they can act as if they're in this place until it's actually integrated, which is technically not authentic, right? Well, the wanting to do so is authentic, but the expression or whatever is being filtered. It's being managed. There's certainly no surrender here. This is very purposeful. Like you're creating also your own rigid structures in the way in which you're communicating. And I don't know that that's a terrible thing, but some part of that to me is like small s stoicism. Sort of like that, and the thing is socially we continue to talk about that. We continue to use the word tolerate. Like that continues to be our reference, our social reference point of our capacity to tolerate people who are different than us. And it's just like, we need to move away from that idea of tolerating, because tolerating has got a lot of problems with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Tolerating something you do so you don't get shot.
Yeah, I think tolerating is a step up from some of what's happening.
Sure. Yes, and there's
it's
that
like
yes.
That certainly, it has its merit. I'm remembering, did you ever read The 7 Habits?
No.
But you know what it is.
I could be conflating it with the 5 agreements, 4 agreements.
No, Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's like super orange personal development.
I think I have that book somewhere.
Yeah.
Highly Effective People. Yeah.
I read it a million years ago. It's
same here.
For an orange personal development book, it's fantastic. And he talks about seek first to understand and then to be understood. Like, there's a lot of foundations in there that I think are still really relevant. But one of them is he talks about synergy as opposed to tolerance. And I think maybe the context was diversity or something. This was written a million years ago, but God, what was the chapter on? I can't remember, but I think it was him. He was talking about how tolerance is good enough. We need to, move beyond tolerance to something like synergy.
Yeah. Yeah, when you say that, it lands for me as like game A is tolerance, game in between is synergy, and game
in between.
game B. Well, I've called it game A.5, but when I told
that's
Peter,
the problem with game A and B. It's got to be like game A and D, or game A and like X.
Well, unfortunately, the idea of game B came up, and then they realized, oh, that's probably, I imagine they realized that's a really big gap to span. So there's probably going to be something in between. And so I always talk,
black and white.
I used to talk about his game 8.5, and then I noticed Peter started, I don't know where he got it from, or maybe he created it as like game in between. I'm like, okay, fine, that's better than 8.5. Fine, you win the language war or whatever, the naming war. But yeah, that synergy would sort of be game in between, so that you can bridge the gap between, and then game B would probably be something like I guess it'd be love to some extent. Yes. Yes. Yeah, well, there's an eye roll about it to a certain extent,
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, the statement was just, I just found that really funny. That's a video clip. It's just that one statement. Well, good thing you're recording. Also, I think it's just incredibly oversimplified and overgeneralized. The whole game A, game B thing, and maybe I don't understand it well enough, but it's just like, I think it's a little too black and white. I think it's a little too thesis antithesis. I think maybe, there's other people who've done a lot more thinking about game A and game B than I have. And I don't mean thesis antithesis in the current COVID way. I mean in the more just generalized Wait, like game A is thesis, game B is antithesis, and we need like synthesis, and
Well,
like it's
okay,
like here's what's
but
wrong, here's the solution. Well, actually, maybe there's something right about what's wrong, something wrong about what's right. And we need an integration.
well, I think that's baked in. I mean, I know you don't spend too much time digging in this particular area, but I actually think that's kind of baked into the people who are, if you even want to call it, calling for game B, or at least trying to figure out how we would make that transition to game B. But I think theoretically, I don't see a particular problem with the idea of game B being the next stage to move through to. So,
Sure.
you know, and you have to, you know, you know, if we like our integral theory, you know, it's transcend and include, and you kind of got to go through that game A, you know, orange, very orange cultural sort of position to get to something that's a little bit more transcendent. But I think part of the problem is that when you're just looking at making that leap from game A to game B, it is a bridge too far. And it's like if I just decided to live as I think game B should be, I basically, I think in many ways I'm alienating game A. And you need more of that synthesis. You need more of you need the bridge to make the cross. You
Yeah.
don't need the two islands. And I think we need to start building the bridge. And then when we're on the bridge, we have a little bit more a sense of what's actually possible. And maybe even game B still isn't possible. Maybe there's another game in between or another
Yeah.
middle island or something. But
I mean, I'm appreciating how B is, you know, the advantage to it being B and not X is like, well, then there's still a C and a D and an E. Like it's just part of the journey and not necessarily, I hope it's not being held as the end goal. I just made a connection between it and the integral stages, or the integral, there are no integral. I guess there's spiral dynamics integral is the integral stages technically, but like,
tier two.
you know, if the connection between, you know, the mapping it onto the stages, if I see an error, and again, my naivety is, my ignorance is front and center here because I haven't been paying too much attention to these conversations, but it's like I'm seeing game A as, oh, maybe, you know, I could just see another way they're looking, but I'm seeing game A as like orange and game B as like integral, and I'm like, as teal, I'm like, what about green? Like, shouldn't green be the in between? But the other way to look at it is game A is first tier and game B is second tier.
Yes. Well, I actually think game B is probably third tier, and game in between is
well,
actually
just skip second tier.
Either well, no, but that's why there's a game in between. That's why I think there needs to be a game in between, right? Because if you're going to build that bridge, you need to be able to hold multiple perspectives. So you need to have an idea of what's on the island that you're headed to, and you have to have an idea of where you're coming from. So I think you actually have, if you're going to start to build the structures that will build the sustainable structures, you can't just build the sustainable structures without actually being in game B. So I think you got to be closer to it. It's, you know, if we think about the spiral, right, there's the point, the transition point where you're starting to make that shift from one stage to the other, right? And there's something about that needs to be the game in between, is that transition point. But it could take some time for that, but it has to be, and it, like we've been saying, or you've been saying, and I think I've been saying it too, that's the synthesis part. That is, but we still don't fully know what game B is. So we're synthesizing the theory of game B with the reality of game A. And through that process, I think the idea is that we will actually get a better sense of what game B is. And it might not be what we theorized it is. It might be something different.
Almost certainly not.
Well, of course. Yeah,
I just like, I think I worry, I judge. I judge, not in you, but like in just the general conversation that I see from afar that I'm not involved in. Until now, I guess I'm involved in the conversation right now. But it's like I judge a certain amount of arrogance in the like, we know what's needed. Like that statement you came up with a couple of years ago. Like, don't be so arrogant to think you know what someone else needs. It's like I'm starting more and more to see the world as really complex, this emergent, complex living system.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, the game A, is trying to map a grid onto a living system, and that doesn't work. And
Mm-hmm.
so like that's leaving and something new is coming, but to think we know, I think we can start to identify what works and what doesn't, or what works in certain contexts and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh. Did I lose you? Your video.
Plan for the future and to strategize and like what's the best way forward. And Angie keeps pointing out to me like how it's not serving me. It's not working for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like it can go in so many different directions, and there's a certain degree to which I think, and this might be me being arrogant, thinking I know what's needed, but like I think we need to like let go of steering, not let go entirely, but to some degree let go of steering this thing.
But what?
So
Mm-hmm.
it's like what I see. So I'm just coming up with this right now, but it's like there's a bit of an elitism, judgmental. I'm totally judgmental here, but it's like there's a little bit of this like integral elitism of like we're in our high castle in a very privileged position as well, of like we can see more than everyone else can see, so we don't have to deal with some of the other stuff that people who can't see this stuff have to. I don't know. I'm rambling and I'm jumbling my words here, but like I imagine there's like these people in this high castle who they can see more of the map.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because they're in the high castle. They
Yeah, they
can
got
see
a
more of
better
the
vantage
layout. They
point.
can see more of what's going on, and there's kind of like an arrogance and a sense of like we know what's best. We know what's best for you.
What
We
if,
and we see where it's come, and so we think we know where it's going
okay.
beyond this.
So what if it's not we know what's best, it's just we know what's next?
Well, I don't know that we do, or they do.
What if game B is the not grasping part, the not trying to control? What if it's actually a certain degree of surrender?
I mean,
More
I dig that.
more
I'm into that. I'm not
capital
against
S
game B.
stoicism, right? More capital S stoicism, the idea of living in accordance with nature rather than trying to work against it or
I
control it.
mean, I'm all for that. I'm all for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be in my own high castle, just like this is what I'll condone. This is what I'll approve. This is, I'm not against game B, but I am cautious of those individuals or those parts of maybe all of us who think that we know what's best, and also there's a part there's, so I'm concerned about thinking we know what's best. I'm also concerned with thinking we have more control and influence than we actually have. Like there's a certain amount of, I think, like the system is so fucking large. The system, the
Mm-hmm.
the interacting multitude of systems is so fucking large, consisting of 7 or 8 billion, how many billion people there are on the planet, and
Mm-hmm.
all these different governments. Now we have like AI in the mix. There's all these different interacting systems. There's
Mm-hmm.
all these non-human create like natural systems. A lot of fucking things going on.
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, reminded me of something really cool that I'm going to share on Facebook, which has nothing to do with this, nothing to do with any of this,
Okay.
but just bookmark that. It has to do with the moon.
Something really cool. All right.
I thought was really cool, but I'm a
Okay.
nerd,
Okay, go on.
and it has nothing to do with this. But it's like I've become really fucking humble, maybe too humble, probably too humble. But over the last couple of years, and I've had my own sort of personal regressions or places
Mm-hmm.
where I've been getting really stuck or places where I've been really isolating
Mm-hmm.
myself. But it's like there's a certain degree to which I realize how little control I have and how much, if I want to maintain any sort of sanity in my life, I
Mhm.
kind of have to like let go and allow and watch the chaos and tell myself the story that the chaos is super intelligent.
Well, it's a self-organizing system.
Yeah, yeah. And that for instance, all this increase in polarization we're experiencing this past year, especially around vaccination, but all sorts of other stuff, it's
Mhm.
like on there's a part of me that's like society is crumbling and we are fucked. And it's just like, people adding insult to injury with the polarization. It's just like it's increasing the polarization. There's a part of me I just have to tell myself a story and look for evidence.
Mhm.
This is my own pseudoscientific uh, confirmation bias, but looking for evidence that confirms my story of the polarization is good. I mean, it's bad and it's terrible, but it's also like, look how many people driving to think about this problem more deeply. Look how many more people are offering programs around polarization. Look how many people are driven to like, I can't tolerate this anymore. I am done tolerating. I need to learn new ways to deal with it. I need to start learning how to have these conversations. Like that is
Okay.
it's a developmental crisis. Like
Sure.
individuals have their development, like Keegan talks about, the individual has his or her or their developmental crisis at a certain stage where their current mode of thinking no longer is able to deal with it. And I think as
Mhm.
a society, the crises that we're facing in the world are creating polarization. The polarization is creating more crisis, but it's creating that developmental crisis that, again, this narrative I have to tell myself is like, ultimately the system reorganizes and self-organizes and emerges and bifurcates into something ultimately better.
Well, that's the problem.
Messy, but better.
That's the one problem with that, right? Because I guess there's a few things here. One, I'm hearing you talk about something about, perceiving the good, or at least the necessity of what is happening to get us to somewhere else better.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with that. And I think integral theory would agree with that as well. So when I hold that, then I just look at what we were talking about earlier, is this question about whether or not you're resisting what is, or whether or not you're going to just allow it and stay out of the way. However,
Mm-hmm.
what that also, the polarization that you're saying that, might have its use and everything else, it's like, but those are the actions of individual people either resisting the way. So it's like, yes, you as an individual person amongst 7 billion in one particular nation in the world, you have very little individual impact.
Mm-hmm.
However, if everybody didn't do anything, nothing would ever change. So you also have to realize that, your actions in the world actually contribute to the complexity and to the change
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
So full blown, and not that I think you're advocating for apathy, but for anybody who
Definitely
is,
not.
full
Definitely
blown
not.
apathy doesn't get anything fucking done, unless, of course, you perceive that you are so toxic and in a position of power such that you could sway things in a really terrible direction. And again, that trust that the response to it, the chaos that that person creates, will have a particular response. Where I maybe take issue with the last thing that you said is that it occurs to me that we can, whatever the next thing is, I don't think we're guaranteed that it is better. I think we can move based on an addiction, we can move forward based on an allergy, or we can move forward based on the idea of it being clean or equanimous or something like that. And we might not actually know until we have hindsight to look back on it and see whether or not that served us or not, and I guess that's based on weighing the pros and cons. How many people died? Or,
Oh God.
like,
Jeez.
how many
Yeah. Well, I mean, like,
atrocities took
we,
place?
part of the, I think part of what's needed, what I think is needed,